So karuna, compassion, I wanted to specifically talk about compassion and self-compassion as a compassionate act towards others, which sounds a little strange, but I think given the state of the world sometimes, given the way that our society is, it's really easy for us to fall into compassion fatigue. And the best way I have found to increase my bandwidth for compassion towards others has been to learn to have compassion for myself as well. So we're talking about self-compassion as a courageous act, as a generous act, if that makes sense. So when I talk about compassion, the best way I've heard it explained is, or defined, is the quivering of the heart in response to pain. Right? So compassion, the quivering of the heart in response to pain. We talk about loving kindness, right? Which we talked about last week, one of these 4 Brahma Viharas, divine abodes of the heart. Loving kindness is its own big, lovely, wonderful thing. But when we go to compassion, this is where we bring loving kindness towards pain. Right? So we're talking about the quivering of the heart in response to pain. And I find that this comes kind of second nature for a lot of us, right? Not all of us, but for me at least, it comes second nature. When I know when my dog was a puppy and he would like accidentally jump in too deep of a puddle and freak out, like I'd be like, oh, it's okay, So it's like when our pet gets injured, when you see a kiddo drop their ice cream cone, when, these little things happen, it's just that little, oh, response that kind of is innately in us all. And it's something we can't help in a lot of ways. And the problem is we very rarely, or at least I very rarely, had a compassionate response to my own suffering, right? I had a hard time being like, oh, with myself, without either spinning into total pity, like the biggest pity party East Nashville's ever seen, or pushing away that feeling because that quiver is uncomfortable, right? So I want to talk about a couple things. I want to talk about, a personal reflection on how I came to understand self-compassion. I want to talk about Buddhist and current relevance, like why this is important given, where we're at in our evolution as a society and as a planet and as a country. I want to talk about the near and far enemy. That's one of my favorite things to talk about when we talk about heart practice. And then obviously we'll talk about practical application. And this is just how to practice it. How do we practice on the cushion and off the cushion? So I need to start with telling you a story. I love my little stories. And most of my awesome stories come from retreat experience. So I think I told a retreat story last week, so I'm going to tell you another one this week. Has anybody been on a meditation retreat before? Okay, very nice. Okay. If you have not, highly recommend it. It is such a great way to jumpstart your practice. A lot of times they have scholarships available. There's one, this is like a total sidebar, but you should totally go on retreat. There's a retreat center called Goenka that's really neat, and it is free, like totally free, and it's 10 days. It's awesome. So my little pitch for go on retreat. It's awesome. So I was on my first retreat ever, actually with this Wild Heart crew when I first started coming here about 4 years ago. I was on my first retreat, and I was really excited, and it was in North Carolina. So I had, we carpooled. There was a couple of us that carpooled, but I didn't know the 2 people I was carpooling with. One of them was this bodybuilder, weightlifting dude, and another one was a whimsy hula hooper human. It was cool. People I probably wouldn't have normally hung out with. But we got to talking and realized that we liked some of the same music. And it was a nice time, And we got to the meditation center. And most of the time with meditation retreats, they're silent. So that was the extent of our friendshipping, right? Because we had to go right into silence. And so it's kind of funny because the whole time you're on retreat, you're like, I know them. Like secretly in your brain, you're like, that's my friend. It's cute. And I don't know, when you're on retreat and you're kind of silent and just really in the practice, you start to see a lot of things, right? This is where we talk about wisdom, right? And so you start to see a lot of things. And I remember one particular night, one of my new friends was in front of me in the line to get to the Dharma hall. And they put their shoes off to the side. Like think about like a path, Dharma hall, and there's a little covered portion, and then there's a lawn over here. So my friend put their shoes off to the side and walked in the Dharma hall. And I, started untying my shoes. And as I'm untying my shoes, it starts to rain. And so my mind goes, this is my friend. I can't let their shoes get wet. So I pick up my friend's shoes and I take them over to the covered porch, and I put them in a little shoe cubby. And I'm like, all right, that was a kind thing to do. And so I start walking into the Dharma hall. And for those of you who may have heard this story, I apologize, but it's one of my favorites. I start walking into the Dharma hall, and then my mind starts spinning. What comes up? Oh my gosh, what if they come out and they don't know where their shoes are? What if they're like, who the fuck moved my shoes? What if they start to get angry? What if they are like confused? What if they think someone stole them? And my brain starts to just like overthink and overthink. So I get to my little meditation station and I am faced with a choice. I can go back and I can put the shoes back where they were. I can sit in my own discomfort, or I can go and break silence and tell this person that I moved their shoes so they aren't stressed out when they go back outside. It's so funny to retell it. And so I opted for the third option. I walk up to this person who's already in their like meditative posture, and I'm like, okay, this is my friend, this will be fine. And I kind of tap them on the shoulder and I start doing charades. So I go, and they're like, I go, and they're like, and I'm like, I moved your shoes. It's starting to rain. And they go, oh. And so I get back to my meditation cushion. I'm like, whoop, fix that. And I start to sit down, and what comes up? I start to be like, you are such an asshole for breaking silence at this retreat to tell somebody that you moved their shoes. It's ridiculous. And so my mind just starts to get so mean to me. Just starts to say like, you should have just not moved them in the first place. What makes you think that you need to fix everybody else's problems? And I was just trying to do something kind, right? And it's now turned into this whole thing because I moved some shoes. And so if you've ever been on meditation retreat, or when you go on meditation retreat, you're a little tender. And so I start crying in the middle of the Dharma hall. I start sobbing because I'm just so tired of my mind playing these same old tapes on me all the fucking time. No matter what I do, I'm a piece of shit. And so earlier in the day, they had set up on the little cork board some sign-ups for one-on-one interviews with the teachers, Mikey and Andrew. And I was like, I'm not going to take a spot. I'm doing great. I'm going to leave it for somebody else who needs it. And you bet in that moment, as I start crying about these shoes, I get up and I walk back to the main part, and I put my name on that list. And I go back to the Dharma hall and I cry through the whole sit. And when I go and talk to the teacher, Andrew, about this, I tell him the whole story because we're allowed to break silence in that moment. And I thought he was going to give me some big, like, you did the right thing, And he just goes, sometimes all we can do is just say, hey, mind, it really crushes me when you do that. It really crushes me when you treat me like that. And I went, oh. Because that's what I would have said to one of my friends who told me that story. I'd be like, oh, sweetie, it's okay. You're just doing your best. Aw. I would have had some compassion. But I didn't have a lot of access to self-compassion for a lot of reasons. And we'll talk about that kind of as we move into the near and far enemies, but this is literally the first time that I started to understand what self-compassion was. And so the more that I came out of retreat and practiced this in the real world, when I would see my pain, I would go, ooh, that really crushes me. That really crushes me that you're doing that, mind. Or like I get awful migraines. When I get a migraine, oh, that really sucks. I'm sorry. Oh, right? And it's a great and worthy practice that I want to share with y'all tonight. So I want to talk about why we need compassion. So we're talking about Buddhist relevance here. So in Buddhism, we have the Four Noble Truths, right? And I'm not going to give you more things to list. We're just going to talk about the first one tonight. And the first one is that there is suffering. Have you noticed life is hard? Have you noticed things can be difficult? First noble truth. And so it is because of this, it is because there is pain, it is because it is inevitable that we are going to suffer, that compassion is necessary. If there was no suffering, there'd be no compassion, right? And we can't have compassion without suffering. It's this whole thing. It's this delicate dance. So there's a big connection to loving kindness towards pain and the existence of pain itself. And again, bringing this into the light of like current events and what's been going on, outside our country and inside our country, and just from a more like social justice place, there's a lot of suffering. There's a lot of suffering in the world right now. And we see it every time we turn on our phone. Right? So I called my wife on the way over here because she's a therapist, which is like so helpful. And I called her, I'm like, can you explain compassion fatigue to me? And she explained it as when the amount of empathy that we take in or that we experience, or the amount of compassion that we experience is beyond our capacity for it. And I don't know about you, but personally, I'm getting there. And I've been getting there for a long time. And it's easy for me to get there. It's easy for me to go down a rabbit hole of all these things that just make my heart break over and over and over for others. And so there's, again, a line, because we don't want to not have compassion, right? Like we want to care. In some ways, it's good information. It's like, oh, we genuinely care about other people. Hooray. And the more that we go down these rabbit holes, the harder it is to maintain hope. And sometimes in Buddhist circles, we don't really talk about hope. But in a lot of ways, it's kind of all we have. And I will be super honest with y'all, like I'm not as much of an activist as I would like to be. And this dude is. So this is Lama Rod Owens, who is a queer Black Dharma teacher. And he wrote this book called Love and Rage. And anytime somebody like brings up social justice or things like that, I always bring it into this book. Like we talk about this book, and he got another book called Radical Dharma. Super awesome books. But I wanted to read a chapter from this book on heartbrokenness. So the first quote is, In truth, we have to integrate our wounds into our understanding of who we are and what we are really capable of so that we can be whole human beings. Only from there can we begin the process of healing the brokenness, the brokenheartedness within ourselves that is the foundation for beginning to heal in our larger society. I think I want to read more of what he says. He says, to begin with, I have to confess that I didn't want to write this chapter. I didn't want to write my suffering into words because to do so means that I have to acknowledge it and give them much more life than they already have. Can I really afford more suffering? Can anyone? A voice in my head keeps telling me that I am a teacher and that all is a trap for me. None of this is safe. This is not appropriate. Then I think that this lack of acknowledging my suffering is how systems of power and abuse are maintained. There is great violence when we avoid our pain because we become trapped in reacting to it as we target others as a reason for our hurt. This is why our anger and rage is dangerous. It is not the experience of anger itself, but our intense reaction to it. The reaction is also the avoidance of experiencing the experience of anger. But am I avoiding my pain? I really don't want to write this. There's some questions that haunt me. When do I get good enough so that my despair goes away? Who will love me enough when they see who I really am? And then what of these hours sitting with the shadows and memories that are the hardest to stay present with? Who will hold me? Why do I keep running everyone away? Will I survive another night alone? Will I suffocate in the silence that sometimes feels violent for me? Are there any more uses to tears than just crying? How will I choose to avoid this breaking heart tonight? Another Beyonce song? A drink? A few swipes on Grindr? Or do I wander the streets like I used to when the depression was the hardest in the middle of the night, wanting the shadows to swallow me whole? Despair is hopelessness. Often in my tradition of Buddhism, we don't like to talk about hope, as it is something that takes us out of the present moment and into the future. But for those of us who survive present moments of deep pain and despair, our hope is the only thing we have. To look forward to the future that is a little less dark, a little more happy and liberated. To dream new ways of being not what I am now. This is possible because of the tenet of impermanence. Everything is shifting and turning around and bouncing here and there. Everything is movement, shuffling, a dynamic, jostling bass beat pounding to the vibrancy of breath and life. So you should get this book. It's a real good one. And so I love all that's in there, but specifically that first little bit of like how self-compassion increases our capacity to hold compassion for others. Does that make any sense? Yeah? And so I talked a little bit about this last week as well, the two wings of awakening, right? So we have the wing of compassion and the wing of wisdom, or the wing of heart and the wing of insight. And when I first came into the spiritual path, I was like 100% wisdom, 100% insight all the time. I wanted to think my way out of my suffering, right? I tried to figure it out. I got intellectual about it, which is why sometimes when I do groups, I tell people don't take notes because it's the mind trying to intellectualize it, right? That's why sometimes when I give a talk, I say, take what resonates and leave the rest. Because we don't need to figure it all out all the time. But yeah, when I came to this, I wanted to figure it out. I wanted to think my way out of my suffering. And the thing that's interesting about that is when you spend so much time in clarity, you find things you don't like, right? I said this last week, you find things that are unpleasant. And so it's what do we do with those things that we find? So wisdom is a way to see, and compassion is a way to be. And only when they're in balance can we really wake up. And so this practice of compassion for self gave me permission to just be with my pain in a kind and loving way. Not needing to push it away, not needing to roll around in it because it feels so good. I kind of had an aversion to compassion. It felt icky. It felt like the woe is me. And it wasn't until I got hip to the near and the far enemies of compassion and of this heart practice that I realized why I had such an aversion. So, near and far enemy. How many of y'all have heard me talk about this before? What a near and a far enemy is? Anybody? All right, so we're gonna run it back. So, near enemy and far enemy. Each one of the Brahma Viharas, there's 4 of them. So there's loving kindness, compassion, non-attached appreciation, and equanimity. Each one of these things has a near and a far enemy. So the far enemy is the opposite, or I like to say, a good indication that you need to practice one of these things, right? If you're experiencing a lot of ill will and hatred, could be a good time to practice metta. So it makes sense. That's what the far enemy is. Now the near enemy, in my opinion, is the little sneaky one. It's more subtle, right? It's more cunning. And so the near enemy is when our practice gets warped, when the mind gets a hold of heart practice, maybe is a good way to explain it. When the mind gets a hold of heart practice, it starts to warp and wobble into an unskillful way to practice. So when we notice a near enemy, it's a good indicator to come back to basics, to come back to the body, to come back to the heart. Because these heart practices are not a practice of the mind, they're a practice of the body and a practice of the heart. Because, like I said, that awe we get when we see a little puppy who's injured, right? That awe that we feel, it's in the body, right? So we're working with the body, which can be tough. And I'll talk about that when we get to practice stuff. But so that's what near and far enemy means, right? And I didn't know why I had an aversion to compassion until I realized what the near enemy of compassion is, which is pity, right? So the near enemy of compassion is pity. When the mind gets a hold of compassion, it can turn into pity. And pity was something that came through a lot during my experience coming out as queer in the church. Right? And again, there's no hard feelings. We've worked on this, right? It's all good. But when I came out, there was a lot of pity that came to me. There was a lot of pity from people around me. They said, "Oh, your heart's broken. Oh, you poor thing." And I heard it so much that I started to believe it. So what this did for me, especially as an adolescent coming out queer in the church and experiencing a lot of pity, is it started to get me used to rolling around in my suffering. That was comfortable. That was something I was used to. And so as I grew into an adult, when pity started to come up, it became one of the qualities I disliked the most about myself, right? So I started to mistake compassion for pity or pity for compassion. So many pages. Can you tell I prepared so much? So yeah, that's pity. So if you notice pity coming up, get back to basics. And then the far enemy is cruelty. And I would say there's a good chance if we're all here, we genuinely give a shit about how we show up in the world. So we're probably not actively practicing cruelty. So good job. Good on you. Don't want to assume. But wisdom, this practice of wisdom, gives us an opportunity to see how cruelty shows up in our own mind. And the compassion, like I said, gives us tools to be able to meet that in a way that's in alignment with our own desire for happiness and awakening. So those two things, right? Pity and cruelty. When you notice those things coming up, again, cruelty is here. I should practice compassion, right? And pity is here. I should get back to basics. Make any sense? So how do we practice this? I love a good practical application. The line that I always say is, this is all great information, Maddie, but what do I do with it? So let's talk about it. First things first, on the cushion, just like all the other Brahma Viharas, our anchor becomes the phrases. It becomes different for each one, but for compassion, the phrases that I have used that have been helpful for me, especially in self-compassion, is I see you, I feel you, I know you, I love you. And this can be towards yourself, whatever that means to you, or it can be towards your pain. Right? It could be towards a painful situation. I see you, I feel you, I know you, I love you. And sometimes just acknowledging it really brings a lot of relief. And so one disclaimer here, just because I know I have this and some other folks I've worked with have had this. So if you have any type of trauma history, right, meditation can be potentially triggering, right, especially when we're talking about pain. So there's a couple things while we're in the practice, I just want to kind of like put out there as some useful tools. And while you're practicing it on your own, or even in general, right? So if you have any history of trauma, if you have any history of like anxiety, it can be a little triggering. So the best thing to do when you're on the cushion in a meditation, and then all of a sudden you feel a little triggered or something like that, the best thing you can do is immediately pull out of the practice, right? I sometimes like to stand up and like walk for a moment, right? And again, there's a fine line because we want to be with our pain too. Can we be with the panic? Can we be with the trigger in a kind and compassionate way? But we have to decide, when is it compassionate to pull out, right? When is it compassionate to take a step back? And only you know that for yourself. So you just kind of get up, pull out of the meditation, and then ground yourself in an anchor that feels safe. Sometimes for me, I like to look at all the blue things in the room and start to name all the blue things in the room. Or like count things, count the number of letters on the board or things like that. Just some grounding practices for you. If anybody experiences some trauma, it's a good way to get out of it, especially with this kind of practice. So we'll do this practice here in a second. But what about when you're out in the world, right? There's ways to practice this when you're out in the world. And one of the ways feels kind of too simple. It's to be with your pain as it arises daily, just day to day. If things are painful, being like, I see you, I feel you, I know you, I love you, right? Because when we approach it that way, we can learn to make a skillful action if skillful action is needed, right? We're not reacting, we are acting. Yeah. And practicing just a little awe with yourself. A good way to do that is to talk to yourself like you'd talk to a good friend. But yeah, this practice has been so helpful in so many ways. And I always like to mention the difference between dry and wet practice, because sometimes when we do phrases, it can sound a little dry. I think you've heard me use the phrase dharma detention. It literally feels like you're just like Bart Simpson writing the same thing on the board over and over. And I want to just like get it out there. That's okay. Absolutely all right. You don't have to feel this in order for it to be a useful, worthwhile practice. So you've heard me say, what one thinks and ponders upon becomes the inclination of the mind. So thinking and pondering upon being kind to our pain, there's worse things to do. There's worse things to think and ponder upon, right? So if you get to that dharma detention level, A-okay, you have my permission. That's all right. You don't have to feel this. We call that dry practice. Now, wet practice is when we're like in it, ooey gooey. We are in the feels, we are in heart. Compassion is present. That's the difference, right? So whatever it ends up being, know that that's okay. It's not meant to be any certain way. So yeah, pain is just one of these inevitable parts of life, and especially with our access to social media, pain of others is a very, very undeniable part of our current experience. And so instead of trying to think our way out of it, instead of starting to feel hopeless that we can't do anything about it, about other people's suffering, can we learn that attending to our own suffering is in its own right a courageous and generous act? And we need compassion to be able to wake up. We need compassion in order to be able to see clearly. And instead of turning away from pain or rolling around in it because it feels so comfy and we're so used to it, can we just be present and tactful and find refuge in the phrases? And really, this practice has changed my life in so many ways, because it's just gone from when I used to experience things that were painful in my own mind, I just push it away and be like, get out of here, get out of here, get out of here. I don't want you, I don't want you. And now I can just be like, oh, mind, it really crushes me when you do that. And it just feels so soft. And that softness is compassion. And so I hope you can find some softness as we move into practicing this tonight. And if you can't, that's okay, because you don't have to be any certain way here. So thank you for your time and for listening to me.
What's up, y'all? Reverend Mikey Noshel here from Wild Heart Meditation Center in Nashville, Tennessee. Thanks for checking us out. Do me a favor, please like and subscribe. And if you feel moved to leave a donation, you can do so at wildheartmeditationcenter.org or the Venmo link in the description. Peace and love.